The Pale Lady. In places where people were locked away and forgotten, witnesses across centuries described the same figure. A woman standing silently in the distance, her skin unnaturally pale, her expression empty yet aware. She never spoke, she never approached, she simply watched. Guards saw her in castles, nurses reported her in hospitals, prisoners whispered about her in underground tunnels. No records ever named her, yet the descriptions never changed. They called her the Pale Lady. This is not a ghost story created for fear. It is a pattern buried inside real historical records. A presence that appears wherever suffering was hidden, identities erased and silence enforced. Tonight, we uncover who the Pale Lady truly represents, why history keeps seeing her, and what her continued appearance says about the systems humanity built to forget its own victims. The first recorded Pale Lady. The earliest reliable accounts of a woman matching the Pale Lady description appear in medieval England during the late 13th century. At Beeston Castle in Cheshire, a fortified structure built to project royal authority, political prisoners were routinely confined without trial. Among them were noblewomen whose families had fallen out of favor. One such prisoner was Isabelle de Warenne, a woman whose name survives in fragments of correspondence and administrative records. She was held for years under harsh conditions, separated from allies, and deprived of adequate food. Chroniclers from the period describe her physical decline in subtle language, noting her wan complexion and frail state. After her death, guards began reporting sightings of a pale woman near the inner tower ruins. These reports were written without theatrical language. They described no sound, no aggression, and no interaction. Just a woman standing motionless, observing. Over decades, multiple witnesses recorded the same details independently. Historians today believe these sightings reflect the persistence of collective memory rather than supernatural events. Isabelle de Warenne became a symbol, not a spirit. Her suffering embedded itself into the place itself, repeated through observation and retelling until her identity dissolved into a figure without a name. When castles became symbols. Medieval castles were not merely military structures, they were instruments of control. Women imprisoned within them were rarely documented in detail, their experiences considered irrelevant to political outcomes. When they died, records often noted only dates, not circumstances. The Pale Lady legend grew in these environments because castles functioned as spaces where power silenced vulnerability. When guards reported seeing a pale woman, they were not encountering a ghost. They were confronting the psychological residue of injustice. The human mind struggles to process prolonged cruelty without narrative. Over time, suffering condenses into imagery. The Pale Lady became the visual shorthand for the cost of power enforced without accountability. As castles declined and were abandoned, the stories remained. Visitors centuries later reported similar sightings, unaware of earlier records. This continuity reinforced the legend, not because it was supernatural, but because the structure itself carried unresolved history. By the 19th century, society replaced castles with institutions. Asylums, workhouses, and prisons were constructed to manage populations deemed undesirable. Mental illness, poverty, grief, and nonconformity were treated as problems to be isolated. Records from these facilities reveal widespread neglect, overcrowding, and abuse. At Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, staff logs from the late 1800s mention a recurring figure seen at night. Nurses described a thin woman wearing a hospital gown, standing at the end of corridors. Her skin was described as pale, almost translucent. No patient records matched her appearance. Sightings often preceded patient deaths or sudden psychological breakdowns. Administrators dismissed these reports as stress-induced hallucinations. Yet they continued for decades. Similar accounts appear in European asylums, written in different languages, but describing the same silent figure. The Pale Lady emerged again, shaped by new walls, but driven by the same human conditions. Psychologists studying institutional trauma explain that when individuals are exposed to prolonged suffering without agency, the brain creates symbolic representations to process fear. These figures are not imagined randomly. They follow patterns rooted in environment and experience. The Pale Lady embodies vulnerability stripped of identity. She does not attack because victims rarely could. She does not speak because voices were ignored. Her pale appearance reflects malnutrition, illness, and emotional exhaustion. When staff members reported seeing her, they were unconsciously confronting the consequences of a system they participated in. The mind externalized guilt and helplessness into a figure that could be observed but not addressed. Over time, repeated descriptions reinforced the image, allowing it to spread across institutions without direct communication. The Paris Catacombs case. In 1896, Paris police documented a case involving a man who entered the catacombs alone and became lost for days. When he emerged, severely dehydrated and disoriented, his testimony was recorded before his condition worsened. He claimed a pale woman guided him through the tunnels in silence. She appeared suddenly, walked ahead of him, and vanished once he reached an exit. Investigators found no evidence of another person. The man later died from exposure-related complications. Authorities ruled his experience a hallucination. However, historians note his descriptions of the tunnels were precise, including routes rarely known outside official maps. The Pale Lady appeared once more in an underground space built to store the dead, reinforcing the pattern. She emerges where humanity attempts to organize suffering out of sight. Why she has no name. Across all documented cases, the Pale Lady is never identified. This absence is critical. Historically, women confined by institutions lost their names through bureaucratic neglect. Patients were assigned numbers. Prisoners were reduced to categories. Burial records omitted identities. The Pale Lady reflects this erasure. She is not one woman, but many. Her lack of a name allows her to persist across time and geography. She becomes transferable, adaptable to new locations without contradiction. This explains why descriptions remain consistent even when witnesses are unaware of earlier accounts. The image survives because the conditions that create it persist. Modern psychological interpretation. Modern trauma research supports this explanation. When individuals encounter environments saturated with unresolved suffering, the brain seeks coherence. Visual symbols emerge as a form of meaning-making. The Pale Lady represents unresolved moral debt. She appears in abandoned hospitals, closed prisons, and former detention centers because these spaces retain emotional weight. Visitors report unease, not because of ghosts, but because the human mind responds to historical context, even unconsciously. The figure becomes a narrative anchor, allowing discomfort to take shape. 20th century echoes. Reports resembling the Pale Lady continued into the 20th century. During the decline of large psychiatric institutions, staff at closing facilities documented sightings during final evacuations. War-era detention centers produced similar accounts. Each time the figure appeared during periods of transition, when systems were being dismantled and histories risked being buried. The Pale Lady surfaces when society attempts to move forward without reflection. She interrupts forgetting. Why history keeps repeating her. The Pale Lady is not bound to architecture. She is bound to behavior. Wherever systems prioritize efficiency over dignity, she appears. Her persistence suggests humanity has not fully reckoned with its institutional past. She is the consequence of treating people as problems rather than individuals. As long as suffering is hidden rather than addressed, the image remains relevant. The Pale Lady does not haunt places. She haunts decisions. The real meaning. The true horror of the Pale Lady is not whether she exists physically. It is why so many people across history believed they saw her. She represents the cost of silence, the aftermath of neglect, and the human tendency to erase discomfort rather than confront it. Every generation encounters her because every generation builds new systems that risk repeating old mistakes. She stands quietly in the background of history, reminding us that what we choose not to see never truly disappears.